I only needed shelter. But this broken workshop already knew my family's name.
No coat worth keeping, no room to return to, no family photograph, just a cracked brown purse and $10 she had counted beneath a bus station light. And with that $10, she bought an antique fletching studio gone gray outside Grayling, Crawford County, Michigan. A place erased from county maps in 1978. The north sill had rotted through. Half the chimney leaned toward the marsh. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the first thaw of spring. Yet beneath the velvet floor of a cedar goose-feather box, a sealed double wall had waited more than 30 years, holding money, a jade arrow, and a design meant for her hands. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Phoebe Eleanor Hale had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Bay City, she measured winter by the frost, climbing the kitchen glass, and trouble by how softly her parents closed doors. The family sold farm equipment, then promises. Phoebe learned to mend hems, stretch soup, and keep still when adults spoke in numbers. Her mother, Lillian, had beautiful handwriting and a habit of polishing already clean silver when bills arrived. Her father was gone before Phoebe turned 12, leaving one wool coat, a forwarding address that failed, and the careful absence of his name at supper. The only person who seemed to belong fully to his own hands was her grandfather, Amos Hale. He lived outside Mio in a tar paper house behind red pines and repaired fishing lures, canoe ribs, and target bows for men who preferred patience to talk. Every Saturday, Phoebe rode with him to the Osable River, where they gathered straight cedar windfall and wild turkey feathers left snagged in low brush. Back at his bench, Amos showed her how grain could be persuaded but not bullied. He heated shafts above a kerosene lamp, rolled them beneath his palm, and sighted along each length until the wavering line became true. Phoebe swept shavings, melted hide glue, and learned that left wing and right wing feathers could not be mixed without making an arrow quarrel with itself. Resistance is not always against you, Amos once told her, pinching a trimmed feather between two scarred fingers. Sometimes it is the only thing keeping you straight. She remembered the fingers before she understood the words. He died during an April flood when she was 16. By the time the river dropped, his landlord had emptied the house. The shaving knife, brass fletching jig, cedar patterns, and notebooks disappeared into an estate sale Phoebe never heard about until it was over. She kept only lamp smoke remembered on wool. The man who ended her family home wore rubber overshoes polished to a dark shine. Martin Voss represented the private lender that had purchased her mother's debt, though he spoke as if the debt were personal. He arrived twice a week without knocking, set folders square with the table edge, and lowered his voice whenever he said foreclosure. There was no court officer or posted hearing, only signatures pressed from a frightened woman and locks scheduled before dawn. Voss never touched Phoebe. He made the rooms smaller by standing in them. On November 28, 2022, he came with a locksmith and a roll of red sealing tape. Snow moved sideways across the porch. Phoebe had packed Amos's wool scarf, 2 shirts, and the blue enamel cup she had used since childhood. Voss lifted the cup from her bag and placed it on the counter. You leave with nothing except what you're carrying. 8 words. His hand remained on the cup. Phoebe looked at her mother. Lillian stood beside the silver drawer with both hands folded over the key. She did not protest. She did not look away either. That was worse. Phoebe removed the scarf, shirts, and cup, set them in a clean row on the floor, then walked outside with the cracked purse under her arm. The locksmith shut the door gently. For 6 weeks she moved north in pieces. She slept 2 nights in a warming shelter in Saginaw, 3 beneath the reading room windows of the Midland Library, and 1 in a laundromat restroom until the owner found her at 4 and gave her coffee. In Mount Pleasant, she spent $2.16 on oatmeal and rode a church van to Clare. By Christmas, $7 earned washing motel linens had become $2.40. The original 10 stayed folded behind Amos's library card. She slept behind the bus depot with cardboard beneath her hips, then crossed to Houghton Lake where a housekeeper let her rest in a linen closet. The extra money fell to 12 cents. Phoebe counted hunger by the tremor in her fingers when she buttoned her coat. On January 9th, she entered the Grayling branch library to escape a wind that had frozen the wet edges of her shoes. Near the copier stood a corkboard layered with notices and one yellowed county auction sheet. At the bottom, typed crookedly, was a condemned property offered for $10 in unpaid transfer fees. Former Hale Fletching Works, structure and contents, purchaser responsible for all repairs. She read the surname twice. The librarian, a narrow woman with a silver braid, watched Phoebe copy the address onto the back of a grocery receipt. "County office closes at 4, she said, then slid a bus timetable across the desk. Phoebe opened the hidden fold of her purse. The original $10 bill lay there, softened at the creases but unspent. Enough. The paper felt warmer than the room. She folded the auction notice into a square no larger than a matchbook, tucked it behind Amos's old library card in her purse, and walked toward the bus station before caution could find a voice. By dusk, the road north had begun to carry her toward the forgotten shop with her own name on it. The bus left Grayling before Phoebe had both feet on the pavement. Its tires hissed through brown slush, and for a moment she stood beneath the station awning with her purse pressed under her coat, watching the red taillights diminish along M72. The driver had carried her 43 miles from Houghton Lake and accepted the last 12 cents with a look that said he knew it was not enough. She had walked 9 miles before that ride. That ride, slept one night in a hay barn outside Roscommon, and awakened to 13 degrees below zero, with straw frozen to the damp sleeve beneath her cheek. Grayling seemed to have been built from brick, snow, and the steady passing of trucks. She moved east beneath signs for Spike's Keg of Nails, Grayling Restaurant, Northbound Outfitters, Paddle Hard Brewing, and Family Fare, gathering their warm windows as a traveler gathers proof that other lives continue. A baker inside one doorway turned a tray. Someone laughed behind glass. Phoebe kept walking. The Crawford County building stood square against the pale morning, its steps scraped clean except for a narrow ridge of ice beside the rail. Inside, heat struck her face with the smell of wet wool and old paper. She followed a painted arrow to the clerk's office and found a woman seated behind a counter high enough to conceal everything but her shoulders. The woman wore one hearing aid the color of a peach pit. Her nameplate read Mrs. Edna Kroll, County Clerk. Phoebe set the auction notice on the counter. Mrs. Kroll read it, then looked at Phoebe's shoes. The left sole had opened along the toe and was tied closed with white thread. "You understand the building has no active utilities?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been tested?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the condemnation order stays until inspection?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county will not refund your money?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Kroll removed her glasses and polished them with a square of flannel. Most people pause before the fourth warning. I paused before I came in. The clerk studied her for another breath, then opened a green ledger and placed a form beneath the counter lamp. Phoebe wrote slowly. Her fingers had not warmed enough to keep the pen from trembling, so she braced her wrist with the other hand. Under purchase price, she entered $10. Under former use, she copied the words Antique Fletching Studio, though the letters looked too dignified for a building scheduled to be torn down. When she unfolded the bill, Mrs. Kroll did not take it at once. The paper had softened from 6 weeks against Phoebe's body. A faint brown stain marked one corner where melted snow had reached through the purse. Mrs. Kroll held it by the edges, laid it flat in the cash drawer, and brought down a brass stamp with a deliberate blow. The deed received a raised seal. "North on Old 27, she said. "Right at North Downriver Road. 2 miles past the canoe livery, take the unplowed lane beside a split granite marker. If you reach the power cut, you have gone too far." Phoebe folded the deed. Mrs. Kroll's hand remained on it. "Hale," she said, "your people from Oscoda County? My grandfather lived near Mio. What was his name?" "Amos Hale." The clerk's fingers tightened slightly, leaving a crescent in the paper. She rose, crossed to a cabinet, and pulled out a transfer ledger older than the green one. Its spine opened reluctantly. On a page dated August 1947, she ran one finger beneath several names until it stopped at Amos Elwood Hale, apprentice, age 17. He worked there. Phoebe leaned closer. The entry recorded a temporary residence in the rear room of Hale Fletching Works and $6 weekly pay. Beneath it, in faded ink, someone had written that the apprentice showed unusual skill in shaft correction and feather balance. "He never told me," Phoebe said. "Maybe he meant to." Mrs. Kroll closed the book. The woman who owned the shop was Beatrice Hale, his aunt, I believe. She refused every offer after it closed, even when the taxes began swallowing the land. When she died, the title wandered through 3 estates and sat untouched. Why $10? Because the county wanted responsibility more than money. Mrs. Kroll pushed the deed across the counter. Then she opened the drawer again, took out Phoebe's bill, and placed it beneath the coin tray rather than with the day's currency. "The building is yours," she said. Whether that is good news remains undecided. Outside, snow had begun falling in grains too fine to make sound. Phoebe followed Old 27, then turned east where North Down River Road ran beneath jack pines. The plowed shoulder narrowed. Trucks passed with the curtains of salt, and she turned her face away each time. At the canoe livery, an empty rack stood locked beside a painted river map. Beyond it, the road became quieter. A man splitting kindling beside a mailbox raised one mitten. His gray beard had frozen into 2 points. "You after the Hale place?" Phoebe stopped. "That way," he said, pointing with the maul. "Name's Orson Pike. I'm the last roof before yours." A black and white dog emerged from behind the woodpile and barked once, as if fulfilling an obligation. "That's Tiller," Orson said. "He'll visit. Don't feed him unless you mean to continue." Behind his house stood 3 walnut trees, their bare limbs lifting dark against the snow. The same trees continued along the abandoned lane, older and farther apart, until the road disappeared beneath drifts. Phoebe walked the final mile, carrying the deed inside her glove. The granite marker appeared first, half buried and split from top to bottom. Beyond it, the studio waited in a clearing above a narrow marsh. It was built of weathered tamarack boards over a fieldstone foundation, perhaps 24 feet wide and 40 feet long. The roof sagged above the north wall, and several cedar shingles had slid into the snow like fallen scales. A brick chimney leaned away from the ridge. Over the doorway hung a carved sign, blackened by rain but still readable where the grain had held. Hale Fletching Works shaft straightened. Feathers cut. Phoebe placed one hand against the door. The wood yielded before she turned the iron latch. Cold air moved out carrying the sour sweetness of old beeswax, spoiled rabbit skin glue, and cedar shut too long from daylight. The floor gave a low complaint beneath her first step. Loose goose feathers lifted from the corners and drifted around her knees, their edges gray with dust. The front room held a narrow counter, 2 stools, and a cast-iron stove furred with rust. Broken arrow shafts lay beneath spider silk along one wall. When Phoebe touched the counter, grit pressed into her palm, fine as flour. Somewhere overhead, a drop of snowmelt struck metal at slow intervals. The back room was darker. Her fingers found shelves, a hand-cranked grinder, and the cold flank of a cedar chest taller than her waist. Its lid was too heavy to raise. She smelled mouse nesting beneath the floor and heard a faint scratching behind the plaster, followed by silence so complete that her own breathing seemed borrowed. She returned to the front room before sunset and pushed debris from a space beside the stove. From a cupboard she took a length of moth-eaten canvas, shook it once outside, and folded it beneath her body. Hunger tightened and released without result. She drank melted snow from an enamel glue pot after rinsing it 3 times, tasting iron and smoke. Darkness entered early through the boarded windows. The temperature inside fell until her breath hung above her face. Phoebe lay on the floor with the purse beneath her head, one hand resting on the raised seal of the deed. Through the boards came the movement of the walnut branches, and farther away, water turning beneath ice. Sometimes we need a little resistance, because resistance is what keeps us flying true. By morning, the canvas beneath Phoebe had stiffened with frost. She spent 3 days learning what the property would permit. The hand pump beside the walnuts gave nothing until she poured melted snow into its throat and worked the iron handle 57 times. Brown water coughed out, then cleared. The outhouse leaned but held. Inside, each floorboard had its warning. A groan near the stove, 2 clicks beside the counter, and 1 hollow note before the back room. On the 4th morning, she walked into Grayling for lamp oil and nails. Pike's Hardware occupied a brick storefront with fogged windows and a bell that struck twice when the door opened. The room smelled of rope, machine grease, and cedar kindling. Behind the counter stood a man with 1 white eyebrow and 1 black, as if age had begun its work and paused. "Elias Pike," he said. "Orson's brother." Phoebe laid the deed before him. Elias read the address. "You have money?" "No." "You have work?" "I have a building." That was not my question. Not yet. He opened a ruled account book, wrote Phoebe Hale across a clean page, and drew 1 line beneath it. 30 days, materials only. No tobacco, candy, or foolishness. Yes, sir. From a shelf, he added a stained paperback titled Repairs for the Rural Owner. Free. The chimney pages are mostly honest. She left with a wire flue brush for $6.75, braided rope for $3.20, stove polish for $1.10, cut nails for $2.85, and 2 pounds of beans for 68 cents. Elias entered every figure without rounding. Phoebe read the chimney chapter twice. Because the brick stack leaned and might be cracked, she worked chiefly from below. She removed the stovepipe, packed wet rags around the opening, and tied the brush between 2 rope lengths. A stone carried one end down the flue, then she pulled from inside. The first pass released a whisper, the second brought curled plates of creosote thick as bark. She covered her mouth with torn canvas and kept working while soot entered her sleeves, ears, and the beds of her nails. She scraped the smoke shelf with a bent putty knife, checked visible mortar joints by lamplight, and brushed until only fawn gray dust fell. 5 hours passed. Before lighting anything, she held a candle at the stove collar. The flame bent inward. She fed the fire walnut twigs, then cedar no thicker than her thumb. Smoke rose, hesitated, and vanished into the pipe. The iron began to tick. Phoebe boiled well water for 20 minutes and cooked the beans with salt Elias had folded into paper. She ate from the rinsed glue pot. The meal tasted faintly of iron and old hide, but steam warmed her face. For the first time since November, heat came from something she had repaired herself. Daylight made the workroom readable. A maple straightening board lay beneath the bench, its grooves darkened by thousands of cedar shafts. Beside it stood a brass fletching jig with 3 jaws spaced at exact thirds. There were 2 feather knives, one worn hollow by a right hand. A stone press for glued veins, silk winding thread gone the color of weak tea, a horn cup crusted with rabbit skin glue, and unfinished shafts marked in pencil for spine weight. Nothing had been tossed carelessly. Even the broken things had been placed. The great cedar box in the rear room had been built low and broad, so full-length quills would not bend. Its lid lifted on leather hinges after Phoebe cleared a mouse nest from the back. Inside, goose and turkey feathers rested in shallow trays arranged by wing. She removed them one by one. The bottom was lined in green velvet. When she tapped beneath it, the sound changed. The left side answered solidly. The right returned a brief open note. She pressed both palms against the boards, then tilted the box with a pry bar. That end carried more weight than cedar and feathers could explain. Phoebe freed the velvet tacks with the putty knife. Beneath the cloth, the floor appeared seamless except for a cedar disc no wider than a silver dollar. Its grain matched the surrounding board so exactly that dust had hidden it. She inserted the point of a feather knife into the disc's center hole and turned. The disc rose on a concealed thread. Below it waited a brass ring. Phoebe cleaned the edges and moved the lamp closer before pulling. Half the false bottom lifted like a shallow lid, revealing a wax paper-lined cavity. 4 parcels lay inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with silk. The first held a shaving knife with a black walnut handle, a bone folder, and crescent spring shears. The second contained matched goose primaries protected between cedar slips. In the third were brass gauges, a miniature alcohol burner, rolled drawings, and a jade arrow no longer than her smallest finger. 3 translucent feathers spiraled along its shaft. The final parcel was a tin document box. Inside, brittle bank straps enclosed stacks of currency. Beneath them lay canvas coin rolls and a sealed envelope written in a hand Phoebe knew before she allowed herself to name it. She set the letter aside. At the bench, she made columns on the back of an invoice and counted each stack twice. The currency included 20s, 10s, 5s, and 1s printed across several decades. The rolls held Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half dollars, Mercury dimes, and wheat cents. In a separate pouch lay a tarnished Purple Heart engraved Henry E. Vale, 1944. The paper money totaled $30,840. The coins, counted only at face value, added $1,060. Together, they made $31,900 exactly. Phoebe sat with both hands beneath the bench. The lamp flame shifted whenever wind entered through the rotten sill. Loose feathers moved across the boards with the dry sound of grass. She placed the metal beside the jade arrow, returned every stack to its strap, and closed the tin box. She still did not open the letter. Outside, dusk had turned the marsh the color of hammered lead. Phoebe walked to the creek and stood above a narrow opening where water remained visible beneath shelf ice. It traveled black and steady under the frozen banks, carrying small bubbles toward a place she could not see. She stayed until her fingers went numb and the first star appeared beyond the walnuts. The letter could wait until morning. Sometimes we need a little resistance because resistance is what keeps us flying true. Morning entered through a split in the eastern board and laid one narrow stripe across the envelope. Phoebe carried it to the counter without opening it. The letters had been made with a fountain pen held at a slight inward angle, each capital leaning as if into wind. She had seen that hand on birthday cards, fishing maps, and the labels Amos fixed to jars of screws. Even the final stroke beneath her name was his. She broke the seal with the bone folder. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this, then the shop has outlasted my strength and perhaps my name." In September of 1991, Dr. Ruth Mercer in Alpena told me I had pulmonary fibrosis and should no longer breathe cedar dust, feather meal, or smoke from hot glue. "I close this hiding place before winter because a man should prepare his bench for the next pair of hands. You deserve to know whose bench it was." Silas Hale began straightening pine shafts in Concord, Massachusetts in 1868. His daughter Miriam carried the trade to Grand Rapids in 1894 and taught her daughter Beatrice, born there in 1878. Beatrice married Henry Vale in 1901 and moved north to Grayling, where they opened this shop in 1907. Their daughter Eleanor kept the books and cut feathers until 1936. Eleanor's sister, Ruth, was my mother. I came here from Mio in 1947, 17 years old and more certain than useful. Henry was killed in France during the First World War. Beatrice kept his tools, his flag, and later his nephew's Purple Heart from the war that followed. She worked until her fingers would no longer close around the knife. The trade closed on October 3, 1960. For more than 30 years after that date, the rooms held only weather, mice, and what we had failed to finish. The money is not payment. It is time. Use it carefully enough that another person may someday use what remains. Heat rabbit skin glue to 140 degrees, never boiling. Split only matched wing feathers. Grind each quill flat until no white ridge catches the silk. Set 3 veins at 120 degrees with 1 part glue to 8 parts clean water after the first soaking. Let every binding cure 12 hours before testing the shaft. In a crosswind, a slight helical set is kinder than a hard one. The rolled drawing shows the spiral Beatrice perfected after Henry's death. Do not mistake precision for pride. An arrow flies honestly only when every small resistance has been placed with care. Inheritance is not what sits untouched in a box. It is the work another person can begin because someone before them sharpened the blade, swept the floor, and left enough light to see by. Behind the shop, beyond the walnut nearest the creek, you will find a fieldstone marker cut with 3 feathers. Stand there before deciding what belongs to you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Elwood. Hale, November 12, 1991. Phoebe read the letter twice. The second reading took longer. When she finished, she pressed each page flat with both palms and folded it along the original creases, never making a new one. She returned it to the envelope but did not seal it. Amos had already done all the closing it required. She went through the back door with the letter inside her coat. Snow reached above her ankles. The walnut nearest the creek stood apart from the others, its trunk divided 6 feet from the ground. Phoebe circled it once and found a low trail hidden beneath bramble. 30 paces farther on, a fieldstone rose from the bank no higher than her knee. 3 feathers had been carved into its face. Time had softened their edges, but the pattern remained clear. Each vein turned slightly around a single shaft. The same deliberate spiral shone on the jade arrow. Phoebe brushed snow from the stone until her fingers met a shallow hollow at its base. There was nothing inside. It was not a grave or a cache. It was a place made for standing. She stood there, back inside. Phoebe filled the miniature alcohol burner and trimmed its wick. The brass cap resisted, then gave with a dry click. When she struck a match, the flame appeared blue and exact, scarcely taller than a thumbnail. It lit the black walnut handle of the shaving knife in the worn place where another hand had worked for years. The room gathered around that small light. Mrs. Kroll had hidden the $10 bill beneath her coin tray instead of sending it away with the county deposit. Elias Pike had opened an account without asking for proof that Phoebe would survive the month. Orson had pointed down the lane and let his warning about Tiller stand in place of suspicion. Miss Brenner, the silver-braided librarian, had pushed a bus timetable across the desk before Phoebe knew she would need one. None of them had rescued her. Each had moved one obstacle. Before we go farther, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to. A ride, a meal, a key, a sentence spoken at the right hour. Tell us about it in the comments and let that person's kindness keep traveling. That night, Phoebe wrapped the shaving knife, the brass jig, the jade arrow, and Amos's letter in clean canvas. She placed them beside her head, close enough to touch without waking fully. The burner went dark. The stove held. Outside, the creek continued beneath the ice while the fieldstone kept its 3 carved feathers turned toward the house. The first real snow came on December 2nd and measured 8 inches against the north wall by noon. Phoebe read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove, moving one finger beneath every sentence that mentioned load, overlap, or rot. The shop roof measured 26 by 42 feet with 2 slopes and enough waste along the broken eaves to require 34 bundles of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of felt, and 22 pounds of galvanized nails. Elias entered the figures in his ledger, then brought out a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle. "My brother Daniel used this," he said. "He is done needing it." At the lane, Phoebe met Walter Senn, a retired roofer of 73 with one clouded eye and a red scarf tucked into his collar. He examined the sagging ridge, spat into the snow, and said he would help. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask. They worked 11 days. Walter showed her how to sister a sound rafter against one split near the chimney and bolt the pair together before lifting weight from the wall. They snapped chalk lines across new felt and laid shingles with staggered joints, each course rising 5 inches. Phoebe struck nails too cautiously at first. "That nail's proud." She raised the hatchet. "Pull it." Walter taught her the 3-stroke rhythm: set, drive, finish. By the 4th day, her wrist stopped fighting the tool. By the 8th, the roof shed snow instead of keeping it. On December 14th, Phoebe drove the final ridge nail while Walter held the ladder. Wind moved along the eaves without entering. The roof was straight enough to cast one clean shadow across the snow. Walter looked up once, then folded the scarf beneath his chin. "It will outlast both of us." January revealed what soot had hidden. 3 courses of brick near the roofline had begun to spall, their fired faces breaking away in thin red shells. Mortar powdered beneath Phoebe's thumb. She removed each loose joint with a narrow chisel until the bricks stood separated by clean channels. Elias sold her hydraulic lime and fire clay on the account. Walter gave her the ratio: 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay where heat reached hardest, mixed only to the stiffness of bread dough. For 3 weeks, daytime temperatures stayed in the 20s. Phoebe worked from a plank scaffold braced against the roof. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb, and gloves were too clumsy for pointing joints, so she climbed down, held her fingers above the stove, and returned before the mortar could skin. She replaced 11 bricks, reset the clay flue tile, and rebuilt the crown with a slight slope to shed water. At night, she covered the masonry with old wool and left one pan of warm water beneath it to slow the cure. On January 27th, Walter stood outside while Phoebe lit the test fire. Smoke climbed the chimney in a narrow blue column and cleared the ridge without curling toward the roof. Walter watched it draw. "Clean," he said. Inside, Phoebe placed one hand near the stove collar. No smoke leaked from the joints. The bricks warmed slowly, holding together through heat that would once have opened them. The floors were white pine fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails, though years of soot had turned them nearly black. Phoebe rented a random orbit sander from Elias for $14 a day. She countersank every proud nail, swept twice, and made 3 passes along the grain, first with 80 grit, then 120, and finally 220. The first pass filled the room with a bitter wooden haze. The second exposed long amber lines beneath the dirt. By the third, the boards no longer looked abandoned. They looked tired and clean. She wiped them with mineral spirits and laid down 3 thin coats of oil, rubbing each into the wood with folded cotton. Between coats, she waited until the surface lost its tack. After the last one, she stayed off the floor for the full 48-hour cure, sleeping near the back wall on planks she had not yet finished. The color deepened from dark honey toward mahogany wherever old feet had compressed the grain. One morning, she did none of it. The sander stood unplugged beside the counter while Phoebe sat near the marsh. A great blue heron had landed at the creek opening, its legs set in black water and its neck folded close against the wind. It waited without moving, not hunting, not retreating. Phoebe watched until the bird lifted and crossed above the walnuts. Then she went back inside, swept the untouched floor, and left the tools where they were. Work could resume the next day. There were 8 windows, 3 had no glass at all, 4 held cracked panes patched with cardboard or cloth. One retained its original 1788 glass, a greenish sheet with small waves trapped inside it. Phoebe marked that pane with blue chalk and worked around it last. She cut replacement glass on the counter, bedded each pane in linseed oil putty, and pressed glazing points every 8 inches. Elias showed her how to roll DAP 33 between her palms until it softened, then lay it against the rabbet and draw the putty knife in one long stroke so rain would leave rather than gather. The sash cords had rotted through. Phoebe threaded 1/4-inch cotton cord over each pulley, tied a figure-8 knot around the counterweight, and lowered the iron into the wall pocket by feel. When the knot caught, the sash rose without jerking. She broke one pane by pressing too hard near a cold corner. The sound was small. She swept the pieces, cut another, and began again. On the final window, she cleaned the 1788 glass with warm water and a linen rag. Through its uneven surface, the walnut branches bent and straightened as she moved. A chickadee landed on the nearest limb. Its claws closed around the bark. Phoebe held the putty knife still until the bird tipped its head toward the room, then flew across the white yard. She finished the last bead, wiped the blade, and lowered the sash. The window stayed open only where she chose. Behind the stove, the walls still carried horsehair plaster keyed through hand-split oak lath. Phoebe's first patch fell before supper. The second cracked overnight. The third held until she touched its edge and came away in one piece, shaped like a broken plate. Elias brought an old feed sack from his barn. Inside was clean horsehair saved by his father for plastering. She soaked the hair, teased it apart, and mixed it into lime plaster until each handful carried an even web. The scratch coat went on first, pressed between the laths and scored with the teeth of a wooden comb. Over it, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and gave it 72 hours to cure beneath damp cloth. The finished coat measured scarcely 1/8 inch. She feathered its edge into the old wall with a wet brush. When the surface turned pale and firm, Phoebe rested her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Mallow, who owned the Grayling restaurant, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Tuesday. Her gray hair was pinned with 2 crossed pencils, and each bag held something that would survive cold. Biscuits wrapped in wax paper, bacon ends, apples, or a jar of soup sealed beneath twine. Phoebe once caught her setting down a bag. I owe you," Phoebe said. Doris straightened, rubbed flour from her sleeve, and pointed toward the empty front room. In candles, when the shop reopens, she walked away before Phoebe could answer. Caleb Pike arrived on a blue Schwinn after the first February thaw, a splitting maul balanced across his handlebars. He was 15, narrow as a fence rail with one front tooth chipped into a white crescent. Without introduction, he split the fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths and stacked them beneath the repaired eave. Phoebe offered him 2 silver dimes from the cash. Caleb shook his head, my mother said. About your grandfather, he would say nothing more. Before leaving, he filed the maul's edge on the step and covered the woodpile with a sheet of tar paper weighted by stones. Reverend Boyd passed each morning on his walk from town. He wore a black felt hat too large for his head and carried no Bible. At the lane, he tipped the brim toward Phoebe whether she stood on the roof, at the pump, or ankle-deep in plaster dust. One morning, after seeing smoke rise clean from the chimney, he stopped. Keep these hands steady. Then he continued toward the river. Phoebe postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door lay beneath a workbench and opened onto 7 granite steps descending into cold earth. Below was a 12 by 15-foot room with a fieldstone floor, low joists, and shelves made from split tamarack. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the surrounding stones. 3 curved feathers had been cut into its face around a narrow shaft. Phoebe brushed away the dirt and tested one corner with the pry bar. The slab did not move. She left it. Under the 3rd step, where frost had lifted one stone, her fingers found a small oak box wedged against the wall. Its lid opened without a lock. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been forged into the same 3-feather symbol. Beneath it rested a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the cottage before the walnut trees had grown thick. She held a feather knife in one hand and stared into the camera with Phoebe's long face, Phoebe's level mouth, and the same uneven arch above the left eyebrow. On the back, written in brown ink, were the words, Miriam Vale, daughter of Silas Hale, age 25, summer of 1903. Phoebe carried the tintype upstairs. She placed the brass key on the mantel beside the jade arrow. She did not know what had opened. Snow retreated first from the south wall, then from the lane. The creak grew loud enough to hear through closed windows, and the walnut branches lengthened with pale catkins that shook yellow dust across the roof. Phoebe did not begin making full arrows that spring. She opened the drawings, studied Beatrice's spiral, and decided that wanting a skill was not the same as possessing it. She would spend 1 coin on materials and practice on short cedar samples until her hands could repeat the same angle without correction. The rest of the cash remained wrapped. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 18th, 2024, Phoebe completed her first full hunting arrow. She had rejected 31 shafts before choosing one with grain straight enough to follow from nock to point. She warmed it over the alcohol burner, rolled out the last bend beneath her palm, and checked its spine against Amos's brass gauge. 3 matched goose feathers went into the jig at 120 degrees, each set with Beatrice's slight helical turn. Phoebe wrapped their noses with waxed silk and left the shaft untouched through the night. At dawn, she carried it behind the shop. The arrow crossed the clearing with a quiet rotation and entered the straw target 6 inches left of center. Phoebe smiled, pulled it free, and wrote the wind speed on the shaft. Inside, the front room no longer held darkness by habit. The pine floor shone beneath 2 work tables. 8 restored windows admitted the marsh, the creek, and the walnut trees from different angles. Tools hung above the bench in the order a hand would reach for them. The old counter remained scarred. She had repaired it without sanding those marks away. The brass key waited on the mantel until a January wind broke a dead limb from the oldest walnut. Phoebe cut the branch into stove lengths and found, beneath a shelf of loosened bark, a small iron plate set flush into the trunk. Moss had covered its keyhole. The brass key entered after one careful turn of a wire brush. Inside the tree was a narrow, copper-lined chamber. A folded 48-star American flag rested there, dry and dark blue, with a note wrapped inside it. The handwriting belonged to Miriam Vale. August 7th, 1918 Henry is in France. Mother says flags belong above doors, but this one belongs where weather cannot take it. If he returns, we will unfold it together. If he does not, let the tree keep what the house cannot bear to display. The feathers I cut today would not balance. My hands shook and I spoiled 6. I have left the knife on the bench. Tomorrow I will sharpen it and begin again. Phoebe read the note beneath the open branches. Henry had not returned. The flag had remained folded through 2 wars, the closing of the shop, Amos's illness, and 33 winters after he sealed the cedar box. She did not hang it. She wrapped it in unbleached cotton and placed it in a shallow walnut case beneath the tintype, where no sun reached the fabric. On November 11, 2025, Phoebe carried Henry Vale's Purple Heart to Elmwood Cemetery in Grayling. She found his family stone near the veterans' flags and set the medal beneath his name for the length of the mourning ceremony. Afterward, she cleaned it with a dry cloth and returned it to the shop, not as treasure but as a tool, no longer separated from its story. Phoebe spent 4 coins from the cash. 1 Morgan dollar paid for the cedar billets used in her first year of practice. A Walking Liberty $50 bought goose feathers from a farmer near Mio. 2 Mercury dimes went to Caleb only after he carved replacement knobs for the feather press and accepted payment as a tradesman. The paper money remained untouched. She placed it back in the tin box with the unused coins, added a copy of every repair receipt, and wrote across a new envelope, "For the next one who needs time." The false bottom closed over it. Phoebe replaced the green velvet and pressed each tack into its old hole. The shop reopened without a sign in the newspaper. Doris cleared one corner of the cafe corkboard and Phoebe pinned up an index card. Hale Fletching Works shaft repair. Feather matching. Handwork only. Write your name below. The first week brought 4 names. By spring, there were 17. The following winter, more than 40 people received a folded notice whenever Phoebe had enough finished work to accept another order. No one hurried her. Caleb returned in April carrying a hand-carved sign across the handlebars of the same blue Schwinn. Though his knees now rose too high above the frame, he had copied the old lettering exactly. Hale Fletching Works beneath it he had added 2 words. Daughters Phoebe ran her thumb through the fresh-cut letters. "There are no daughters," she said. Caleb leaned the sign against the counter. His chipped tooth had been repaired, but the white crescent remained faintly visible. There weren't any customers once. He lifted his bicycle from the grass and rode toward town. Phoebe hung the sign below the original one. She did not know whether the final word meant blood, apprenticeship, memory, or someone not yet born. It did not require deciding. That autumn, she opened Amos's envelope and placed a clean sheet beside his letter. She began with the same words. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote that the north sill had been replaced with white oak, that the original glass remained in the eastern sash, and that the chimney drew best when the dampers stood 1 finger-width open. She recorded where the roof carried extra weight, how long lime plaster required before paint, and which floorboard still gave 2 clicks beside the counter. Then she described the work. She explained how a feather should be ground until the quill rested without rocking, how silk must lie firm but not strangled, and how a shaft can seem straight in the hand yet reveal its error in flight. She did not write about courage. She wrote about beginning again the next morning. Near sunset, Phoebe carried the finished arrow to the marsh. The creek moved beneath a skin of new ice, and walnut leaves turned slowly in the shallows. She set the target against the fieldstone marker and walked back 40 yards. Wind crossed from the west. She adjusted her stance, raised the bow, and waited until the branch tips settled. Sometimes we need a little resistance because resistance is what keeps us flying true. The arrow turned through the cold air and entered the center ring. Phoebe left it there while evening gathered around the repaired windows. She went inside, lowered the wick of the alcohol burner, and placed her unfinished letter beside the cedar box. The antique fletching studio waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Mrs. Kroll retired the following summer. While emptying her desk, she found a softened $10 bill beneath the old coin tray, still marked at one corner by melted snow. She placed it in an envelope labeled Hale Property and returned it to the bottom drawer. The drawer closed with the sound of a brass stamp coming down.